Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Weatherby, Director of Communications for the Women's Foundation, and we are honored to have you join us today for a very special Ask Her featuring our new president and CEO, Dr. Tamara Wilds Lawson. For those of you that do not know about the Women's Foundation, we are a community supported organization committed to investing in the potential of women and girls of color across the Washington region. Through our dedicated efforts in grant making and advocacy, we drive impactful change in community practices. And through our partnerships with our many grantee partners, we center the voices and lived experiences of women and girls of color to influence policymakers and philanthropy through the lens of gender and racial equity. Now, as mentioned earlier, today marks a truly exhilarating moment as we embark on this next chapter of the Women's Foundation's history. And we are thrilled to have Tamara at the helm of our organization, bringing her experience and expertise in nonprofit leadership, philanthropy, and community engagement. Now, before we begin, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat and ask any questions you have for Tamara using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Toward the end of the discussion, there will be an opportunity for you to answer your questions by Tamara. And lastly, we ask that if you feel inspired by today's conversation, we invite you to join us by making a donation at thewomensfoundation.org/askher. Again, thewomensfoundation.org/askher, as we continue investing in organizations and initiatives that advance gender and racial equality. Thank you again for joining us. And without further ado, I would like to present to some and introduce to others someone who is no stranger to the Women's Foundation, our moderator for today, Lesli Foster, Weeknight Anchor at WUSA 9.
Good afternoon, everybody. I put yellow on because we needed a bright spot in this gray day, and we're going to find it today because this conversation is all about the future of the Women's Foundation. Now, it is a real joy to be in community with all of you today who could have been anywhere but chose to be here in this moment as we lift up and talk about the leadership of Dr. Tamara Wilds Lawson. And we look forward to what sustainability looks like for this venerable organization that we need in our community. You know this by now. The Women's Foundation needs to be here. The community needs the Women's Foundation, and certainly women and girls, particularly those serviced and centered by the Women's Foundation, need this organization to thrive. And so before we begin our discussion today, I'd love to have you take a moment to read the bio of Tamara. I'm going to introduce her briefly to you as well. And Tamara comes to us from an organization called Act Blue, which is an organization that builds fundraising tools that thousands of groups and really millions of people and grassroots donors have used to have their voices heard and to transform power structures. So she served as the movement, issue, and charitable organizations director. She led a 20-person team to develop strategic partnerships with and to support nonprofits raising funds on the platform. Previously, she spent over a decade in nonprofit leadership as the Chief Community Impact and Inclusion Officer for the Washington Nationals Philanthropies and Director of the Posse Foundation's Washington, D.C. office. Currently, she serves on the National Council of Negro Women Executive Committee and the Board of Directors for the Academy of Hope Public Charter School. She is also a member of Greater Leadership, Greater Washington's class of 2015. Let me get that right, because I know there will be a lot of leadership Greater Washington family members on here supporting and lifting up Tamara today. Tamara is also a proud Washingtonian. She lives in Southeast with her husband and her daughter. So thank you all for joining us. And Tamara, let's get right into it because people are here today excited to hear from you. So before we talk about this exciting role that you have here as president and CEO of as the Washington Area Women's Foundation, let's talk more about your professional background. We got into it just a little bit and the path that led you here to the Women's Foundation.
Thank you, Leslie. Let me just, before I get into that, say how excited I am to be having this conversation with you. specifically. You are a trusted and authentic voice of our regional news, which often ends up being national news. So this is a very cool moment for the foundation and for me specifically. So I just wanted to take that point of personal privilege to geek out a little bit and say, I'm really happy you're here. My professional journey has not been linear, and I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of. I have had various leadership roles throughout my career that I feel specifically and uniquely prepared me to take on this role as president and CEO of Washington Area Women's Foundation. I'll say this, that the places where I spent most of my time were in higher ed and in national politics. And you can learn a lot in those spaces from leaders who didn't necessarily bring their best selves. And I think most important, I learned a lot from the bright lights that shined through in some really dark times in both environments. And I learned a lot about what constructive leadership really looks like. And then I brought those valuable experiences, because I was in higher ed, both as a student and as a professional for a really long time, and was in politics on and off, I'd say for a little under a decade. So I brought those experiences with me into the nonprofit space. And throughout my time in all three spaces, I remained open to take risks and do things that weren't necessarily part of a grand plan. I think the only thing that's in my professional trajectory that I was very clear about was education. I knew from the time I was probably a sophomore in college that I wanted to get an advanced degree, and specifically that I wanted to get a PhD. And outside of that, and in the humanities, I'm a humanities nerd. And then outside of that, I just stayed open and deferred my program to move to Nashville to work for the Gore campaign, for example. And as I stayed open, at each stage, new opportunities came my way. And it feels like this is the perfect role and organization for me to be with at this stage in my life. So if there's any takeaway from my journey, I'd say just being present, seizing the moment, and taking those lessons with me has been a huge part of my professional identity.
And you're going to be using those lessons as we focus on advancing the rights of girls and women in our region, particularly women and girls of color. So I want to learn more a little bit about your personal journey and the experiences that have shaped your unwavering commitment to that of the Women's Foundation, right? I know that you are from Washington, a proud Southeast resident of Washington, D.C., which you share quite often. You still live there. So you are in the same community where you grew up, that made you, that showed you the way and the path to who you could be now. Can you share a bit more of your personal experiences and your insights that have had sort of a profound impact on your dedication to supporting and really uplifting women and girls in our region?
Absolutely. I'll say that throughout my career, from the very beginning, serving marginalized folks was a through line, and then eventually became non-negotiable. When I had any opportunity come my way, that had to be a central part of what I did. And that was seeded early on for me in a couple of places. One, I was raised by a California transplant who moved to DC, as I think I mentioned to you last week, came to DC to attend Howard University for graduate school and never left. I watched her as a child build a community of dynamic women who stood in the gap for her. As a mother of two, I watched my grandmother, who I spent every summer with, build a community of women. She was an educator. In both cases, those communities really helped them be better people, better mothers, better professionals. And so I absorbed all of that. And those were the first spaces where I figured out how powerful women are when we support each other. So that was like the personal context, right? And these were all Black women doing amazing things, often in hostile environments. And so those were my models. And then professionally, I have two specific stories, which I'll share quickly. One is that I had, I said kind of facetiously that you can learn a lot about what not to do as a leader in higher ed. But conversely, I had some wonderful mentors. One in particular, her name is Dr. Sherry Parks, who was my master's thesis and dissertation advisor. And she almost single-handedly willed me through my graduate school experience, was my guardian angel, was my therapist before I started paying for one. Like, she just brought me back from the brink of, fear-based thinking. She just was fantastic. And so as I progressed in my career, I realized what a privilege it was to have her and have just a broader community of people that supported me throughout my higher ed journey and was determined to pay that forward. And I recognize that so many of us, particularly women and girls of color, don't have that. And it's critical. And I would feel irresponsible if I missed any opportunities given the platform that I have to do the same, to pay that forward. The other quick example is that, as you mentioned, I worked for the Posse Foundation for a number of years, and I was overwhelmed by their dogged insistence. It's a college access and leadership program. But I was just so impressed by how dogged they were in their insistence that these young people getting these scholarships to top universities and colleges, it was important for them to get there, but it was equally important for safe and comfortable spaces to be cultivated for them so they could thrive there. And that message carried through, it's also a pipeline. It ends up being a pipeline program for companies all across the country, like Bank of America and Deloitte. And they charge those companies to do the same thing, right? It's not enough to get there. Are you creating an environment in which these folks of color, first generation college students, can thrive? And so that had been part of my lived experience, having gone to school and worked in majority white spaces my whole life, but I had never been associated with an institution for whom that was a central part of the mission. And so both of those examples are part of why I think the work that the Washington Area Women's Foundation does is so critical. They're both about making sure that women and girls across class lines, across sexual orientation, feel seen and have cheerleaders there who can help guide them, through the rough currents in those spaces. So that's a huge part of my identity and another reason why this role has been such a remarkable opportunity for me.
You've talked about the guidance that you have received on your journey, and I wonder what the most impactful piece of advice you've received has helped to guide your work to date.
I'll share two. Well, one has been transformative for me as a professional, and the other is like just operational, but I think important. The first is that as a leader, you've got to make sure everybody on your team understands their value and how they contribute to the success of the organization, whether they are entry-level staff or in the C-suite with you. You've got to intentionally ensure everybody can draw a straight line from what they do to the organization's success. And that has served me well throughout my career. The other one that's much less, it's goofy, but I think it's important, is that Any meeting over 90 minutes should include snacks. If you want to engender goodwill within your team, you need to have some food present.
I think that right there would change the culture of workplaces all over. And also, if you could make the meeting not 90 minutes, but still have snacks, that part would be great too. So I love how you're leading the charge on that, which is really, really important. I see all these hearts coming up too. I think people are feeling what you're saying right now. Let's talk a bit more about philanthropy, because philanthropy has long been recognized as this powerful force in driving positive change and transforming communities, especially in the realms of gender and racial equality. And as we look at emerging from this pandemic in an equitable way, philanthropy is going to be centered in a lot of ways in this whole process. So I'm curious to know what you think the role of philanthropy is and can play in advancing gender equality, and how you plan to harness all the potential to create meaningful impact and lasting change for women and girls in our region.
So as leaders in philanthropy, if we're able to step back from the day-to-day and really be reflective, which, just let me say, is very hard. And that's a conversation for another day. I think it's too hard. But when we are able to do that, kind of push back from the table and be reflective, we realize that we are often the soul of collective responsibility. And, you know, as a specific example, there are local corporations in this region, major institutions, elected officials, you know, local and regional government entities, that they do a lot as leaders. But as leaders and doers of philanthropy, Washington Area Women's Foundation is often in the community. We're asking questions, we're capturing stories and experiences, we're building and maintaining critical grass tops and grassroots relationships. We've done critical research, we're directing resources to spaces and people who are often othered and invisible. That's the specific work that leaders in philanthropy are called to do, that differentiates us from other folks who I named who have a platform. And at the foundation, we recognize that when you look at any troubling data point, and we talked about this previously, Lesli, women and girls, folks of color, are always, and that's not an overstatement, at the bottom of the list. And to carry that point even further, Black women and girls are what I call the data anchors, right? So if we are dogged in our determination to change those outcomes for them in healthcare, in education, in the workforce, in the justice system, if we do that for them, then everybody wins, right? And so specifically at the Washington Area Women's Foundation, if you'll just give me a moment to highlight two of our programs that are great examples of this. You know, we focus on the stark inequity within early education, right? Over 90% of the early education workforce is comprised of women. I don't think that will surprise anybody who's joined us today. But some of the numbers that might is that Black and Hispanic early educators, Latinx educators, make up 3/4 of early educators in the district, earn $2.80 and $4.50 less in hourly wages, respectively, than white early educators in the region. And the poverty rate, which is just a devastating statistic to me, for early educators in the district is 34.4%, Lesli. And in Maryland, the poverty rate is 13.1, and in Virginia, the poverty rate is 16.4. And so the work that we do in that area is critical. And we are among very few organizations that shine a light on that work and direct resources to organizations that are on the front line. And so we also cultivate joy and hope at the Women's Foundation via the Young Women's Initiative, because it's important to focus on those really awful data points and challenges, and simultaneously figure out how to resource joy and celebrate the wonderful things our young women and girls are doing. So with the Young Women's Initiative, since 2017, we've supported and invested $66,000 in 33 young women and gender expansive youth of color through the Rockstar Fund, which was one of the things I was most excited to learn more about when I was interviewing for this role. And so we provide these young women with up to $2,000 to invest in their learning, leadership, ideas, community projects, you name it. We give them a space to share with us why they value it and why they want to push into those areas more. And so we designed the Rockstar Fund as participatory grant making, and that gives our fellows the opportunity to be at the table where decisions are being made, and decide who these awardees should be. So lastly, I'll say these issues and data points, all of this, it's so pervasive for women and girls of color that we play a particularly critical role in shining a light that a donor advised fund, for example, just doesn't have the ability to do. And there are needs that DAFs absolutely can fulfill, but not in the way we do, and not in the intentional way that our fantastic team does. So we're closer to the work, closer to the needs you talked about, and we have the infrastructure to stand in the gap for smaller nonprofits that don't.
I'm glad that you talked a bit more about that, because these are two things that really make the Women's Foundation so special, in addition to all of the other purpose-driven work that is channeled through the vessel of the Women's Foundation. I want to talk a bit more about the things that make women leaders so significant in nonprofits and philanthropy. And when we think about women leaders like you, who have really this extraordinary presence that is both exceptional and indispensable, how does that contribute to the success of a nonprofit in philanthropy?
So listen, if you're in this work as a leader, and as a woman leader specifically, you're not in it for the great stock options, right? You're in it because something about the work resonates with you and drives you to show up every day, giving it your all as your best self. And that's reflected in some fantastic leaders in the region, who I'm actually going to take just a moment to name a handful of them. Kira Jarrett, Heather Peeler, Leicester Johnson, Ryan Palmer are inspiring nonprofit women leaders who have been in this space for quite some time. And if you ask them, I bet they would say it's because they had some early career, personal, some turning point that helped them decide that this was where they were going to focus their talent. This was where they were going to focus their energy. And so when we're at our best, women leaders like those I just named, we hold space for one another. And we're invested in the success of those that we serve, with whom we work. And as women nonprofit EDs, presidents, CEOs, we're often reflective and adaptive in ways that others are not, constantly striving to show up better as leaders and challenging our organizations and peers and those in the philanthropic space to do the same. We're often doing more with less and leading lean and mighty teams. So we're efficient, we're focused, and we speak plainly. And I'll just say a quick anecdote. So I've been in seat for about 6 weeks, and women across the region have been just incredibly supportive, Lesli. And there are folks who are longtime supporters of the foundation. Some of them are on the board, some of them are on the leadership council. and they'd reach out and say, I want to introduce you to her. I want to connect you with this woman. And, I just want you to know, she's a straight shooter. And internally, and sometimes out loud, I'd say, well, great, bring it. So am I. And I think that characteristic, folks just kind of getting to the point, speaking plainly, is what happens when you've been leading in the nonprofit space and you're working with limited resources. You don't have time for a whole bunch of foolishness. Like, let's get to the topic, right? And so that ends up being a characteristic that many of the women that I named and the women that I've engaged with since I started this role, that I really respect. And I think it's a characteristic that helps women nonprofit leaders thrive, right? We've got a lot to do with a little, so let's get to it. And then lastly, I'll say, you described nonprofit leaders, women particularly, as indispensable. And that is both accurate and should also be thought of, I think, as a call to action, because we deserve comprehensive support from funders that demonstrates that value and helps model for younger women. And I think this is a really important point in the nonprofit leadership pipeline, that these roles are worth it, right? They need to be able to see that we can sustain, that we won't burn out. A great example of how this can be done by some funders is a 3-day executive director intensive that I participated in that was sponsored by the Meyer Foundation almost a decade ago, where they brought all of these women. There may have been men in the room, sorry for that erasure, but I remember the women who were brought together and forced to pause and think really strategically about how we wanted to lead, how we wanted to support the folks that our organizations focused on. And I have to tell you, it was transformative for me. And I'll also say that the executive coach that Meyer underwrote for almost a year is the same executive coach that I'm working with today. And so that was a gift to me, to all of the other women that were in that space. And that is the support that I want to encourage funders, particularly of a certain size and stature, to stick with and do, because we need it. We are indispensable. We're doing some hard work. We are leading great teams, and we need to be invested in as we are investing in our communities.
So we're approaching the conclusion of the webinar, but I want to throw a little something in here before we get to this last question.
Sure.
And that is, you talk about the demands on the kinds of leaders like you who are leading organizations doing these kinds of purpose-driven work. And I know that there will be time for you to talk more about all your visions and things for the organization at another time. But I wonder, how do you steel the team that you have for this kind of work? Because as you talk about, this is tough stuff. And you talked about centering joy and really trying to make sure there's some balance there. But there's a lot of work to do in the community. And so I think it might be valuable for all of your peers and folks who are listening to you today talk about leadership. And I also hear this theme of love too, right? Leading with love.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, how do you make sure that you've got to center the work, but how do you make sure that you also make sure that all the people that are working on the work are okay too? Because that's really important.
Yeah, it is. And that's a great question, Leslie. I'd say particularly in the nonprofit space, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. So the tone that you set with and for your team is really important. When I'm at my best as a leader, I demonstrate that I want the staff to take care of themselves. I, for example, encourage them to actually take the time off that they are entitled to, right? when I'm at my best, I'm checking in and making sure everybody understands that if you don't feel well, if you had a tragedy happen in your family, or you wake up and you're not feeling like your best self, you're entitled to take some time so that you can recharge and come back. The work will still be there. And I think in my first 6 weeks, I haven't modeled that so well because I'm still trying to get my arms around everything. But it's important that as leaders, we model what we are charging our staff to do for themselves. And I also think just naming what you mentioned, right? The work, the data that we're steeped in, the relationships that we're building can be heavy. It can be tough stuff. And so saying that, like, I see you, I see what you're doing, I see what we're doing. It's a lot. And in the same way we seek mental health resources for the folks we're serving, I encourage all of us, myself included, to take good care and practice self-care at a high level, right? So not just make sure you eat lunch, but like, are you really pushing away from your work on weekends? Are you moving your body? Are you doing the things that bring you joy? Are you making space for that? Because that's going to feed into your work and ensure that you show up as the best version of yourself, which means we collectively are going to be in a better position to serve our communities.
I love to ask leaders that, particularly Black women leaders, because we are so used to doing the most all the time. And sometimes we don't always recognize that threshold. So it's good to hear you talk about that. We obviously recognize the incredible power that we hold as members of the community to enact positive change and support the vision of the Women's Foundation and organizations like it. And so now I want to ask you, what steps can we take individually and as a whole to ensure that women and girls of color in our region have what they need, the support they need, not just to live, but to thrive and have happy, healthy, and resilient lives? Because that word resilience, I hear us using that a lot more. It's really important.
It is. I've been pretty long-winded, so I'll try to keep this short.
No, you're fine.
For people, I want to make sure people get to the questions. Thank you. So there are 3 takeaways: investing in the region, and I'll give a little color to each of these. Investing in the region, checking in on our individual mindsets, and then selfishly being clear about why Washington Area Women's Foundation is so critical. So as far as investing in the region, a longtime supporter and former board chair of the foundation, Rachel Kronowitz, said something recently that stuck with me, which is, there are reasons and seasons to support national organizations, but it's really local organizations, regional organizations that often need the most consistent support. So as you're looking at your portfolio of organizations that you invest in, really take some time to make sure that the right balance is in place there, and that I'm hoping it leans towards local and regional support. The second piece was mindset, and this is a quick one. It's my belief that we should want for all women and girls what we want for ourselves. And that has been a barometer for me, right? It's a way to keep my privilege in check, and it keeps me laser-like focused on the work at hand, because until they've got the same opportunities and options as my kiddo, the work is not done. And then the third thing is why we're so special as a foundation, why our work is so critical. And I'll say something I haven't said yet, which is that fundraising is expensive and it's labor intensive, especially for smaller grassroots organizations, mom and auntie operations. So those folks can count on us to understand the value of their work, no matter how small their operation. We make the submission process as seamless as possible. We believe in comprehensive grant making. We're giving grants, we're directing you to other resources, we're amplifying your work, but beyond just listing us on your website, we invite you to participate, for example, in this Ask Her series. We're seeking your feedback on how to improve our process, and you're going to get our full attention, and we'll meet you where you are as a grantee. And so I'll segue into my ask, which I would be remiss as the new president and CEO if I didn't make one, right? There's so many organizations, the Women's Foundation included, that are suffering coming out of the pandemic. There was an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy a couple of months ago talking about this, that like 50% or some crazy figure of nonprofits saw a decrease in their net income last year, and that's a lot. And then also the philanthropic funding landscape is dynamic anyway, and it's always shifting. And so we were not immune to that. And as we look to the next 25 years, we're at a critical moment where we have this very clear mandate. We've got excuse the expression, we've got a kick-ass staff, Lesli. They're fantastic. And, we need to rebuild, I'll just be frank, we need to rebuild our financial base in order to push beyond what our founding mothers and earliest supporters even thought was possible. So I'll just say, lastly, since I started, some of our longest standing supporters have really stepped up to the plate and made some significant contributions and investments in our future. And I want to thank them publicly. We're so grateful for that. I'm new, I'm figuring it out, and folks were like, we believe in you and what you have the potential to do. So as much as we need more of those big investments for the massive work ahead, we also need the smaller donations, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, particularly sustaining. So, we can remain a community funded and funding organization.
That sounds great. So this concludes this part of our session here, this discussion part of the session. But I just want to tell you, we're going to pivot a little bit because I see a whole lot of questions here for you, Tamara. And I think it's going to be exciting for you to answer them. And by the way, if you haven't had a chance yet to put your question in the chat, go ahead and do that. We're going to get to them, as many as we can, up until about 12:05. So go ahead now and do that. I'm going to start with the first question here, Tamara, and I'm going to read them verbatim. So, given your recent role at Act Blue in the land of politics, local, regional, and national, could you speak about how you view the Women's Foundation's opportunities to weave advocacy into your work? What are some creative thoughts and experience you bring to bear?
So that is an excellent and very specific question. What I'll grab hold of is the advocacy piece. That is among the things that I am excited to lean into. At the foundation, we are in the nation's capital. We have such a great platform, and we can do even more for our grantees and in our programmatic spaces, including the ones that aren't necessarily focus areas, by using that platform for the greater good. The word creative was in the question. As I continue to get my arms around the work, if there are opportunities for me to access, my inner humanities nerd and write op-eds and, show up in spaces, in accessible spaces, right? Not ivory tower spaces, but show up in spaces and shine a light on some of our program areas or other issues, then I will do that. But I think particularly coming out of the pandemic, as we're still not even really clear about how much damage was done in the lives of women and girls of color, advocacy is going to be a critical tool that we pull out.
Next question is, what is the role of intermediator organizations in today's world? How do you see the foundation balancing its role as fundraiser for the community and leader in/of the community?
Well, I spoke in answering a couple of your questions, about that there are some very specific things as a foundation with a great staff and a committed staff that we're able to do. I'll share. And I don't know if you remember me saying, we meet our grantees where they are. I have a very quick anecdote. I happened to be at our Young Women's Initiative, the national convening of women's organizations from across the country. We're here in DC a week or two ago. And our program officer arranged for one of our rock stars to come there to meet with her. The young lady had made it clear that, she wanted to meet in person and they needed to exchange some information. And so our program officer, Chica, was intentional about that. And I stood off to the side and watched her carefully and intentionally make this young lady feel comfortable to ask whatever she needed to ask without judgment. And she left all smiles, feeling supported. And I know that Chica, we were in a metro accessible place, right? And the amount of work that it took for Chica to make this young lady feel comfortable that's what we do. It's an intangible way that we can stand in the gap for our grantees. And I'll also say something that I did not mention, but is an important part of our work is as intermediaries or, both a grant making and fundraising organization, we lean into collaboration. So 2 specific collaborations that I'll mention. One was this conference, the National Philanthropic Collaborative of Young Women's Initiatives, and the Early Care and Education Funders Collaborative, ECEFC. We are in community with other foundations and funders. We're tracking trends, we're sharing best practices, we're advocating alongside these communities and strategically directing our resources. And again, that's one of the things that makes us super valuable.
Wow. I heard you say the foundation's sustainability is on your agenda. So do you have thoughts about the opportunities for building an endowment in the current environment? What are the pros and cons of that?
Yes. I'm all for it. I think, I've kind of 3 areas that I'm super focused on, and financial stability and sustainability are first on the list, with a path to an endowment. Any organization that has been around this long should have one. And we don't, but we are focused on building from the ground up what's necessary so we can get there and be here for another 25 years. I think they're critical.
Great. So this is a question I asked you during our conversation, but it has come up here, so I will put it back to you, Madam President. Are you considering bringing back the luncheon? I know I speak for many by saying I miss it, and it is a powerful community connector. I had nothing to do with that question, just to be clear. And I'm over here minding my own business, asking you questions, and this showed up. So that's the question, Madam President.
Yeah, it is. I get it. I went to those luncheons. They were phenomenal. So I think it would be irresponsible of us not to consider what that would look like in the future. The board was intentional about kind of easing back into that space, not knowing, what the pandemic would look like in 2023. So, we're going to have a reception. I think there's definitely a world in which a reimagined luncheon will appear. And it was such a powerful convening, networking, celebratory space, and there just was so much energy in the room. So we are as an organization going to figure out how to tap into that and do something that may look different but capture that same energy.
So in the TV world, that's a tease. It might be coming up in 15 more minutes, maybe, possibly, perhaps. Okay, good to know. Here is another question. A lot of people like the fact that you're talking about snacks in the meetings. I mean, sustainability and snacks. If that's what you become known for, I mean, 2 big gifts, 2 wins right there. All right, let's see here. We've got a few more questions here. Lots of excitement from your many sister circle folks sharing a lot of support with you. Now, here's a question. It says, I love the Washington Area Women's Foundation and have been involved for years. Please tell us how you plan to address the lack of opportunities and poverty of all the women in the suburbs who are often forgotten in the discussions.
Talk about a fantastic segue.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, because we talked about this too. So we are already, with our Young Women's Initiative, for example, pushing into Prince George's County because there is a need there. And there's often so much focus on DC. And there is a lot of erasure of communities in need in surrounding counties in Virginia and in Maryland. And it's also, it's a transient region, right? You got folks that are crossing borders all the time. We recognize that and recognize that it's our responsibility to answer the call within our programmatic focus areas in Prince George's County, right? In Montgomery County, in Arlington, Virginia. So not only we're already doing that, but we have plans to do more. And then selfishly, there are some well-to-do folks in the suburbs who we have not reached out to. We're coming for you. We need your support. So we have plans in both spaces in terms of who we serve and then who we reach out to for support.
That's fantastic. I'm going through here just to see if there are any more questions. There's lots of support here for you, lots of excitement.
Thank you.
Again, from the sister circle here, and checking to see if there are any additional questions. I want to make sure I don't miss any of them for you because this is a great opportunity. And listen, if you still have a question on your mind, we've still got a little bit of time. So go ahead and put it in the chat. And I promise I will read it directly here so that you can hear it. While we're waiting, I wonder, just a simple question, what are you looking forward to the most?
Yeah, just a simple
Come
softball question. I would say, when I'm daydreaming, looking out at the squirrels hopping around in my neighbor's yard and thinking about what would make me most happy for the foundation, it's a vision of us as a model for what participatory grant making, what power sharing, what, modeling a more inclusive and intentional philanthropy looks like. And, we have a ways to go to get there, but I believe we have the potential at that YWI conference that I mentioned. We have so much cachet and respect among other women's organizations. And I feel like we have an opportunity and a responsibility to lean into that. So philanthropy in this area is, it is complicated. And in some respects, it can be a little antiquated. And we have a special role to play in shifting that, shifting the narrative, shifting the practice, and showing folks how it's done. So I'm looking forward to all of the necessary work to get us to that point.
Got a couple more questions. Does the Women's Foundation have scholarships to support female students attending private high schools?
We do not, but we love a good opportunity to share resources. So what I encourage you to do is to reach out to us, and we will, to the best of our ability, direct you to other nonprofits that are in that work. And as somebody who has a bias towards great education and access to great education, I might answer that request directly, because there are plenty of resources in the region for those kinds of aspirations.
Last question. If you had a superpower for the day, what would it be and how would you use it?
I would I would pilot Wonder Woman's invisible plane and use her truth-telling lasso simultaneously to buzz around the globe and get folks who are in seats of power to tell the truth more consistently than they do, and come back and report out everything that I've seen, so we can use that. We can arm ourselves with that information to resist all these pervasive isms that the Washington Area Women's Foundation and other nonprofits are focused on fighting every day.
That's a pretty darn good superpower. All right. That was fantastic. Tamara, I have to say, this was just really incredible to spend time with you. I see all the hearts coming up, and clearly all the other women and folks who have joined this conversation feel the same way. Your passion, your commitment for empowering women, empowering girls in our community, particularly communities of color, is inspiring. And we cannot wait to see what happens in the next 25 years, because we're writing this next chapter. Also, before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to remind everybody about the important work of the Women's Foundation. And Tamara talked a good deal about the work that's been done, the work that's being done, and the work still yet to do. But we can't do it without money. And so since its founding, the Women's Foundation has awarded more than $16.7 million in grants to more than 215 community-based organizations and to individuals. And before the foundation's fiscal year ends on June 30th, there are lots of ways that you can show your support. You can do a $25 gift in honor of the organization's 25th anniversary. You can do a $50 recurring donation, which means that you will join the Empower Her monthly giving society. Or you can make a $250 gift to help ensure that Tamara and the great team, what does she call them? Kick-ass, badass. Am I allowed to say badass? I hope that's okay. This is almost over. So if it wasn't okay, it'll be okay in like 7 more minutes. Anyway, we want to make sure that Tamara and the great team here at the Women's Foundation can continue their efforts to support and empower women and girls of color in our region. Oh, and Mayor Jeffrey's on here too. So we can't forget about Mayor Jeffrey. He's part of the Sister Circle anyway. Hey, Jeff. So listen, thank you all. Thank you for making the time to be here this afternoon, for being intentional about your time, much in the same way that Tamara has talked about the work of the Women's Foundation. We want you to continue to support the Women's Foundation. And by the way, stay tuned, because there will be a new series of Ask Her seminars starting in September, which is going to be fantastic. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for lifting up this important work, and thank you for lifting up the new leadership and the dynamic team that helps to make it possible. Because of all of you, they can do what they are doing for our community. So I will turn this back over to the Women's Foundation and say thank you again to all of you who have found community in this amazing community resource, and you show up and you show out in whatever way that you can. We expect you to continue to be here for the journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lesli.